America loves origin stories, the kind where greatness announces itself early. A strong boy, a fearless boy, a future leader already visible. Theodore Roosevelt was none of those things. His story does not begin with confidence or power or destiny. It begins with silence, with weakness, and with fear. In the late 1860s, inside a quiet brownstone on East 20th Street in New York City, a small, fragile child lay awake most nights doing something no child should have to do, fighting for air. Theodore Roosevelt did not dream of greatness as a boy. He gasped. His chest tightened without warning, his lungs locked. Asthma attacks came suddenly, violent, suffocating, terrifying. This was an era before inhalers, before modern medicine, before certainty. Doctors offered little more than hope. On the worst nights, servants rushed him into the darkness, horse-drawn carriages, windows thrown open, cold air slicing his lungs, not as a cure, but as a gamble. Sometimes it worked, sometimes it didn't. His parents watched helplessly as their son hovered between breath and collapse. For a child, this was not just sickness, it was conditioning. It taught him something early, something permanent, that life could abandon you without warning, without mercy. While other boys ran through streets and climbed trees, Theodore watched from the inside, thin, weak, often confined to bed. His body was unreliable, a traitor that could turn against him at any moment. And slowly, quietly, another belief formed alongside the asthma. Weakness was dangerous. Historians often describe young Theodore as delicate. They rarely describe what that does to a mind. Because this child was growing up in a nation obsessed with strength. Post-Civil War America worshipped vigor, expansion, masculinity. And Theodore Roosevelt, future symbol of American toughness, felt none of it inside himself. He felt trapped. He later wrote about these years with restraint, discomfort, challenge, overcoming. What he did not dwell on was fear. The long nights, the suffocation, the knowledge that breathing, something everyone else took for granted, might simply stop. That fear did not weaken him, it sharpened him. But not in the way history prefers to remember. The Roosevelt household was disciplined, wealthy, orderly, and at its center stood Theodore Roosevelt Sr., tall, physically imposing, morally upright, a man of action. Young Theodore adored his father. He also feared disappointing him. At some point, accounts differ on the moment, his father spoke a sentence that would follow Theodore for the rest of his life. "You have the mind," he said, "but you do not have the body." It was not cruel, it was not shouted, but it landed like a verdict. Then came the challenge. You must make your body. History quotes this as motivation, rarely as pressure. But to a child already terrified of fragility, this was not advice, it was survival logic. If your body fails you, you are not safe. If you are not strong, you are not worthy. And Theodore Roosevelt absorbed that belief completely. What followed is usually framed as inspiration. A sickly boy transforms himself. Willpower conquers weakness. The truth is darker. Roosevelt did not train to become strong. He trained to escape fear. Brutal routines, weightlifting, boxing, cold exposure, pain tolerance. This was not balance, this was compulsion. Every ache became proof, every injury acceptable. And still, the asthma never fully left, which meant the threat never left either. This is what history avoids, because the danger was never failure. The danger was that strength was never enough. As he grew older, the pattern hardened. Roosevelt became intolerant of hesitation, suspicious of rest, almost hostile to vulnerability, especially his own. Pain did not discourage him, it validated him. Hardship was proof he was winning. What the world later praised as courage was in part control. Control over a body that once betrayed him. Control over a world that once made him small. By adolescence, he no longer appeared fragile, but the structure was set. He did not want to succeed, he needed to dominate. Not for glory, for safety. And this is why the rest of his life makes sense. The risk-taking, the confrontations, the obsession with action. The boy who couldn't breathe never disappeared. He simply learned to outrun the memory. And here is the truth few documentaries confront. Theodore Roosevelt did not defeat weakness. He organized his entire identity around never facing it again. That distinction matters, because once that pattern exists, it doesn't stay personal. It scales into politics, into war, into power. So when you hear Roosevelt speak of struggle, of discipline, of strength, remember where it began, with a child who believed stopping meant suffocating. And once you believe that, you don't just want to live, you want to prevail, at any cost.
It does not appear in speeches. It is not carved into monuments. It is rarely questioned. You must make your body. On the surface, it sounds harmless, encouraging, almost loving. But sentences do not live in isolation. They live inside people. And in the mind of a frightened child, words can become law. Theodore Roosevelt Sr. was widely admired, a philanthropist, a moral man, physically strong, emotionally controlled, deeply respected. In many ways, he represented the best of 19th century American ideals. And that is precisely why his influence mattered so much. Because young Theodore did not hear that sentence as motivation. He heard it as measurement, a standard he did not yet meet. Roosevelt worshipped his father. That fact is beyond dispute. He followed him, studied him, compared himself to him, and every comparison ended the same way. Not enough, not strong enough, not durable enough, not man enough. This is where the story becomes uncomfortable, because the pressure was not cruelty, it was expectation. And expectation, when internalized early, does not need to be enforced. It enforces itself. Theodore Roosevelt began to live as if weakness were a moral failure, not a condition, not an accident, a failure. This belief did not arrive with violence. It arrived with discipline, routine, standards, self-surveillance. He did not wait for someone to push him. He pushed himself, relentlessly. By his teenage years, Theodore Roosevelt's life was governed by rules he had written for himself. Exercise even when ill, training even when exhausted, endurance regardless of pain. Rest was not recovery. Rest was danger, because rest meant stillness, and stillness reminded him of childhood nights when breathing stopped. So he kept moving. Historians love to celebrate this phase. They call it transformation. They call it resilience. They call it triumph. What they rarely ask is why it had to be so extreme. Because there is a difference between self-improvement and self-correction. Roosevelt wasn't building a body. He was trying to erase a memory. The asthma attacks never fully disappeared. That fact matters. It meant no amount of effort ever felt final. No achievement ever felt secure. And so the work never stopped. This is how compulsion hides inside virtue. America would later praise Roosevelt's energy, his relentless drive, his refusal to slow down. But underneath that drive was a belief he never challenged. If I stop, I become that boy again. There is something else history often misses. Theodore Roosevelt did not just fear physical weakness. He feared dependence. Because dependence meant vulnerability, and vulnerability meant exposure. So he cultivated an identity that allowed no room for either. This is where his worldview quietly forms. Strength is good, action is moral, force resolves uncertainty. These are not political beliefs yet, they are coping mechanisms, and once they work, they are reinforced. Theodore Roosevelt did not learn to sit with discomfort, he learned to overwhelm it. This explains his intolerance for hesitation, his impatience with compromise, his suspicion of softness, especially in men. He did not see gentleness as strength, he saw it as risk. In private writings, Roosevelt often framed struggle as purification. Pain clarified character. Hardship revealed worth. These ideas would later be echoed in his speeches. They would sound inspiring to a nation hungry for confidence. But they originated somewhere far less noble. They began as fear management. Here is the quietly disturbing truth. Roosevelt did not outgrow childhood trauma. He professionalized it. He made it productive. He made it admirable. He made it American. By the time he entered Harvard, Theodore Roosevelt appeared transformed, physically capable, mentally sharp, driven. But inside, the internal pressure had not eased. It had intensified. Because now he had proof that forcing himself worked. And once a method works, it becomes doctrine. This is where restraint becomes dangerous, because a person who believes effort solves everything will eventually encounter problems effort cannot solve. And when that happens, they escalate. Roosevelt's admiration for strength did not stop at the physical. It expanded outward. Strong nations, strong leaders, strong actions. Weakness, whether personal or political, felt intolerable. This was not ideology yet, it was instinct. The pattern is subtle. He did not seek conflict for chaos, he sought it for clarity. Conflict simplifies the world. It divides it into action and outcome. And for someone who feared uncertainty, that was comforting. As Roosevelt matured, this internal framework became invisible even to him. It felt like character, conviction, moral clarity, decisiveness. But it had never been tested against stillness, only against motion. This matters, because one day Theodore Roosevelt would hold power, and power amplifies coping mechanisms. It does not correct them. The boy who could not breathe had learned something dangerous, that survival comes from exertion, that safety comes from dominance, that weakness must be eliminated, not understood. And once that belief leaves the body, it enters policy. Nothing about this makes Roosevelt a villain. That is the wrong frame. It makes him human and deeply shaped. Most people never build an identity strong enough to hide their fear. Roosevelt did, and America would reward him for it. So when you hear the phrase, "you must make your body," understand what it really meant. Not health, not balance, control. And once control becomes your answer, you will apply it everywhere. This is not the story of a boy becoming strong. It is the story of a boy who decided weakness was unacceptable at any scale. And that decision has consequences.
Not gradually, not symbolically, completely. For Theodore Roosevelt, that moment came on a single winter day. February 14, 1884, Valentine's Day. History usually mentions it briefly, almost politely. It should not be polite. That morning, Theodore Roosevelt woke up believing he understood the rules of existence. Work hard, endure pain, control the body, move forward. These rules had served him well. They had carried him through illness, through weakness, through doubt. By that afternoon, they would mean nothing. His mother, Martha Bullock Roosevelt, had been ill. Typhoid fever. Dangerous, but not uncommon. Roosevelt had seen illness before. He had survived it. He believed, as he always did, that effort, vigilance, and attention could manage risk. But illness does not negotiate. And that day, it took her. Quietly, without drama, without permission. Hours later, before the shock could settle, before grief could form words, his wife died. Alice Lee Roosevelt, 22 years old, 2 days after giving birth to their first child. Complications, kidney failure, medical confusion. One death would have broken most people. This was 2. In the same house, on the same day. Roosevelt was 25 years old. He had prepared for struggle, for challenge, for pain with rules. He had not prepared for this. There are no heroic letters from that day, no speeches, no reflections, only a single line in his diary, a black X, and beneath it, 6 words. The light has gone out of my life. Then nothing. He never wrote about her again. This is the detail history rarely pauses on. Not that he was devastated, but that he went silent. Completely. For a man who believed expression was strength, this absence matters. Because silence was not healing. It was shut down. Roosevelt did not grieve publicly. He did not collapse. He did not ask why. He simply removed the event from himself, as if emotion were a limb that could be amputated. This is where the illusion of control breaks, because strength did not protect him. Discipline did not prepare him. Effort did not matter. He lost everything anyway. Most people respond to this kind of loss in one of 2 ways. They break, or they retreat. Roosevelt did neither. He hardened. Friends noticed it. A change, a flatness, less warmth, less patience. He spoke of his wife rarely, if at all. He delegated grief like a task to be avoided. His daughter was sent away to be raised by relatives, not out of cruelty, out of incapacity. This is uncomfortable territory, because it contradicts the myth. The myth says Roosevelt was endlessly resilient. The truth is, he compartmentalized, and that is not the same thing. Grief does not disappear when ignored. It reorganizes the mind. Roosevelt returned to work quickly, too quickly. Politics became motion. Motion became relief. Stillness became intolerable. This is the moment something critical changes. Before this day, Roosevelt believed effort could fix fear. After this day, he learns something else. That emotion is dangerous, because emotion cannot be controlled. So he does what he always does. He removes it. This explains something historians struggle to articulate. Why Roosevelt later in life would appear almost indifferent to personal loss. Why death, even massive death, could be discussed abstractly. Why sacrifice became a concept, not an experience. Because he had already learned the cost of feeling, and he decided it was too high. What he builds next is not resilience. It is insulation. Within months, Roosevelt makes a decision that surprises everyone. He leaves. Not temporarily. Not symbolically. He goes west. The Dakota Badlands, a harsh place, isolated, unforgiving. This is often framed as adventure. It was not. It was exile. The West offered something the East could not: noise, danger, constant demand. Out there, survival required attention, and attention leaves no room for memory. Roosevelt did not go west to find himself. He went west to avoid stillness. This pattern will repeat throughout his life. Whenever emotion threatens to surface, he accelerates. When grief presses in, he seeks action. When reflection approaches, he replaces it with force. This is not courage. It is management. The most quietly disturbing part of this story is not the loss itself. It is what he learned from it. He did not learn that life is fragile. He learned that attachment is liability. That lesson will echo in relationships, in leadership, in policy. It is important to say this clearly. Theodore Roosevelt was not heartless. He was armored, and armor does not feel. Years later, people would praise his decisiveness, his ability to act without hesitation, his emotional steadiness under pressure. Few asked what had been removed to make that possible. This is where the man changes, not visibly, but structurally. The boy who feared suffocation learned to move. The young man who lost everything learned to detach. Together, these lessons form something dangerous, because a person who does not tolerate weakness and does not tolerate grief will eventually treat both as obstacles. Roosevelt would later speak of death as inevitable, necessary, even cleansing. These were not abstract ideas. They were coping strategies. The illusion of control had broken, so he replaced it with something stronger: distance. Distance from pain, distance from memory, distance from vulnerability. And here is the part history rarely confronts. This distance worked. It allowed him to function, to lead, to rise. But it also narrowed his emotional range, simplified moral complexity, reduced human cost to principle. This is not condemnation. It is consequence. When Theodore Roosevelt would later embrace conflict, he would do so with clarity. Not because he loved violence, but because violence does not ask you to feel. It asks you to act. And action had always been his refuge. So when people say that Roosevelt was forged by tragedy, they are right, but not in the way they mean. He was not softened by loss. He was sealed. And once sealed, he could move through the world without hesitation, without pause, without looking back. The light went out of his life. He did not relight it. He replaced it with motion.
The West is usually remembered as a place of discovery, freedom, reinvention, wide skies, and clean beginnings. For Theodore Roosevelt, it was something else entirely. It was distance. When Roosevelt left New York after the deaths of his wife and mother, he did not announce a transformation. He did not describe a spiritual quest. He did not frame it as healing. He simply went west, as far from memory as geography allowed. The Dakota Badlands were harsh even by frontier standards. Wind-scoured plains, brutal winters, unforgiving isolation. This was not a place people chose casually. It was a place they endured. And that mattered, because endurance had always been Roosevelt's language. History often romanticizes this chapter. The future president on horseback, the refined Easterner becoming rugged,
the myth of rebirth. But rebirth requires reflection. Roosevelt was avoiding reflection. Out here, survival demanded constant attention. Livestock had to be protected, weather had to be watched, threats were immediate. There was no time to remember. That was the appeal. In the Badlands, silence existed, but it was not still. It howled, it demanded response, it kept the mind occupied. This was not peace, it was distraction perfected. Roosevelt thrived, not because he was healed, but because he was busy. He embraced danger with the same logic he had embraced discipline. If fear appeared, move faster. If pain surfaced, push through it. If emotion stirred, replace it with action. He hunted relentlessly, tracked game for days, endured exhaustion, accepted physical risk without hesitation. Pain had rules, grief did not, so pain was preferable. Roosevelt's companions noticed something unusual. He was fearless, but not reckless, calm, but distant. He did not speak of his past. He did not share loss. He spoke of tasks, of work, of movement. This is where the transformation is often misunderstood. The West did not toughen Roosevelt. He was already tough. What it did was validate something dangerous. That emotional detachment increased effectiveness. Out here, hesitation could get you killed. Indecision was weakness. Action was survival. This reinforced everything he already believed. He began to admire hardness, not cruelty, hardness. The ability to endure without complaint, to act without reflection, to accept loss as cost. This admiration would follow him, quietly. Roosevelt's time in the Badlands coincided with repeated failures, business losses, destroyed cattle, brutal winters. By any reasonable standard, it was not a success. But that did not matter. Failure did not threaten him, stillness did. So he stayed, longer than expected, deeper than necessary, because every day spent there was a day not spent remembering. Here is the part that rarely gets discussed. The West did not make Roosevelt compassionate. It made him more certain. Life on the frontier simplified morality. There was survival, and there was everything else. Complexity was a luxury. Empathy was optional. This suited him. When Roosevelt returned east periodically, people noticed the change. He seemed harder, more decisive, less emotionally accessible. They mistook this for maturity. It was armor. The Badlands did not erase grief. They taught Roosevelt how to function without acknowledging it. That distinction matters, because avoidance is not resolution. It is postponement. Roosevelt did not become a cowboy. He became something more consequential. A man who believed motion solved meaning. This belief would later define his leadership style. When faced with uncertainty, act. When faced with ambiguity, simplify. When faced with human cost, abstract. These tendencies were not ideological, they were adaptive. And adaptation, when rewarded, becomes permanent. Roosevelt's writing from this period is revealing. He speaks of vigor, of vitality, of the necessity of hardship. But he rarely speaks of people. He speaks of forces, nature, danger, strength. Emotion is almost entirely absent. The West gave him something else, a narrative, a story he could tell himself,
that he had chosen this hardship, that suffering was voluntary, that loss could be reframed as test. This reframing is subtle and powerful, because chosen hardship feels meaningful, unchosen loss does not. By choosing danger, Roosevelt reclaimed agency. He could not choose death, but he could choose risk. This is how grief was managed, not processed, managed. Theodore Roosevelt did not emerge from the West healed. He emerged convinced. Convinced that strength was the answer to uncertainty, that action was the cure for pain, that hesitation was indulge. This conviction would later collide with politics, with war, with power. But at this stage, it was still private, still forming. The West also taught Roosevelt something else, that distance dulls consequence. Out here, losses were immediate and accepted. Animals died, men died, life moved on. This normalized detachment. Roosevelt learned to speak of death practically, as outcome, as necessity. This was not cruelty, it was conditioning. When people later describe Roosevelt as unusually comfortable with violence, they should look here, not to ideology, to coping. The Badlands were not an escape from death, they were training. Eventually, Roosevelt left the West, not because he was finished, but because he was fortified. He had learned how to live without looking inward, and that skill would be essential. When he returned to public life, he carried the West with him, not the romance, the method. Action over reflection, force over uncertainty, movement over memory. This is the man who will soon re-enter politics, not as a grieving widower, but as someone who has decided something quietly, that stillness is dangerous, and that power is movement at scale. The West did not save Theodore Roosevelt, it prepared him to act decisively, to accept loss abstractly, to believe that motion equals morality. And once that belief leaves the frontier, it does not stay personal.
But something important happened to Roosevelt after this. He didn't just become stronger. He became intolerant of weakness in himself and in others. And that belief would soon shape the way he treated people, conflict, and eventually power itself. Because the boy who feared suffocation was about to enter the real world, and the world would feel the consequences. In the next part, we see how this private struggle turned into public action.